I'm Philip Ingram, a former senior British military intelligence officer, now a journalist specialising in intelligence, security, counter-terror, cyber, and a little bit of geopolitics for my sins. But one of my passions is information. And today I want to give you a quick canter through information, the new weapon of war, except we're not actually at war. Now, information is all about influence. And we've seen the power of influence whenever the crowd protesting outside the Capitol building in Washington, the United States, the day that they were counting the Electoral College votes for Joe Biden to be confirmed as the next president of the United States, where that demonstration turned violent and invaded the Capitol building after President Trump made a speech to the crowd. That's the power of influence. Unfortunately, in this occasion, people died and people were injured. So information, influence can lead to physical activity and even death. So we hear about disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, deception, fake news, and so much more. What do they all mean? Well, I'll explore these in this presentation. But I remember as a child, the old cry coming out, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never harm me. Well, the original from the Christian Recorder of March 1862 was words will never break me. But I think the invasion of the Capitol building showed the power of words and those words turning into physical action and that they can harm you or break you. So everyone thinks that this whole information, this whole fake news piece, this whole disinformation is something new. Well, we go back to the 6th century and the great Chinese philosopher and general Sun Tzu said in his book, The Art of War, all warfare is based on deception. Hence my title at the beginning of this presentation. Deception is part of the information, part of the influence operation. And Sun Tzu summed it up very succinctly. I'll let you read his quote. However, coming into the 20th century and the 21st century, a lot of the time we hear when it comes to fake news and stories, we hear it associated with the Russians. It's a Russian thing. Well, the Russians are very good at it. They have a doctrinal term called maskirovka, masking. Immediately after the poisoning of Sergei Skripal in Salisbury with the nerve agent Novichok, when the Russians were called out, President Putin quickly turned around and said, no, it must have escaped from the British chemical warfare establishment at Porton Down. And that was causing doubt in people's minds, which is exactly what he wanted to do. That was maskirovka, masking. And in fact, it turned into the leader of the opposition asking in Parliament why the Russians were being blamed so quickly. He achieved his aim. But the number of countries that operate Russian-style doctrine around the world are enormous. Russia, China, Iran, a lot of the Middle East countries, a lot of the former Soviet bloc countries, they all operate in that environment. And therefore, that's why we see talk about disinformation, misinformation coming out of China, Iran, North Korea, etc. But it wasn't the Russians that were brilliant at it. They are now, and in fact, ISIS is very good at it. But we used to be very good at it, and we just have to go back in recent history to the Second World War. Operation Fortitude convinced Hitler that Allied forces were going to invade through the Pas de Calais, not through Normandy. And they did this through Operation Fortitude by creating the United States First Army Group and convincing Hitler that the First Army Group was going to carry out the invasion and lead the invasion. Part of that was a dead body being dropped out of an aircraft in the Mediterranean, with most secret plans detailing in minute detail the actual invasion plans across the Pas de Calais. It was all fake. They'd calculated that the body would wash ashore where the Germans would find it and it would be analysed, and Hitler fell for it. But it had to be backed up by physical infrastructure on the ground. So the first United States Army Group was created with a real commander, but fake army, fake tanks, fake aircraft, fake radio transmissions, but all of them were placed out in the ground so that as reconnaissance flights went over, they could see them. Fake spies was the Operation Mincemeat bit, dropping the body into the Mediterranean. And it convinced Hitler in the end. So if we're so good at it, or were so good at it, why have we lost this art? That's a rhetorical question. It only impacts the military. No. If we look at the US Securities and Exchange Commission, looking at the impact of false information on different markets, fake news was affecting investment decisions. Independent outlets were being paid to promote stories. Fraudsters may generate articles promoting a company's stock to drive the stock price and profit at your expense. It's got as much an impact and probably more of a potential impact on business than it does from a military perspective. So businesses out there, if you're not looking at information, if you're not looking at the power of influence on your businesses, you're missing a trick. And we only have to look at 5G and see how that trick was missed. The link with 5G to causing coronavirus, the hype that went out around it resulted in anti-5G demonstrations. Those anti-5G demonstrations resulted in 5G masts actually being physically burnt down. That was all through the power of information. Information shared on social media. And one of the differences between Operation Fortitude and now is Operation Fortitude was state controlled at the highest levels. Information was fed out from a coherent plan to make sure that they understood the effect. Today, with social media being able to get into everyone's hands, that control of the information has disappeared. And therefore, anyone that can exercise a degree of control over the way influence works, and I'll touch again on that in a moment, can have the effect that we've seen with 5G, but not just 5G, with the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine for COVID-19. The anti-vaxxers are out. We've heard the 5G linked to causing COVID-19. I read a report recently about people being scared that the vaccine was going to contain microchips that would allow governments to track them. It's all garbage, but it's all information. And you see people physically on the street with cards demonstrating these things. They believe it. There is a power to information. And I don't apologize for going back to the power around what has happened after the US elections and leading up to the invasion of the Capitol building. And we can go back and look at the power of information around Black Lives Matters and so many other protests that are around the place. Information turning into physical activity, turning into violence, turning into people getting hurt, and in some terrible occasions, people getting killed. Information, sticks and stones will break your bones, but words will potentially harm you. So what else does Sun Tzu say? Well, he talks about speed. And taking advantage of unpreparedness. Well, the speed that we have today is through the power of social media. The unpreparedness is the openness that we have, social media, and the freedom of speech that we have in the West. That means that it is very difficult to try and deal with areas where disinformation is coming from. It also talks about irritation. If your opponent is temperamental, seek to irritate him. Can we remember any cases of President Trump being irritated by things that have happened and then he resorts to social media to try and counter that? Have we seen things where President Putin has been irritated and that has resulted in activities in social media and elsewhere in the cyber environment to try and mitigate things? There are lots of examples out there. So looking at some of the definitions, misinformation. Well, it's all about the spread of information, of false information, regardless of intent. So you accidentally retweet something or repost something that is incorrect, you're spreading misinformation. You're not deliberately doing it to cause any harm, but you are spreading misinformation. Too easy to do. Whereas disinformation is all about deliberately spreading misleading information in a way that you know that it's been manipulated for a particular effect. So doing it deliberately because you know it's deliberately wrong. So you know the 5G post is wrong, but you want to stir more people up to try and support the anti-5G campaign or the anti-vaxxers, and you spread a report that you know is false, completely false. You're spreading disinformation. So disinformation is knowingly spreading misinformation. Propaganda is the dissemination of information, facts, rumors, half-truths, or lies to influence public opinion. So that is deliberately done to try and influence public opinion and tends to remain at government levels. But because of the power of social media, because of the power of getting messaging out there, because of the power of so many different companies in a transnational perspective, propaganda is not wholly the pure preserve of governments anymore. So who's getting involved in this? Who are the types of people that we see out there? Well, there's a number of them. We've got the armchair expert. We've all seen them. As soon as the learned professor comes up and gives government policy on something, the armchair expert, because they know someone who's got a knowledge and have read a few things on social media, they decide that they are a much bigger expert than the learned professor or the learned doctor that's giving the scientific evidence, and therefore they counteract the argument that's going out. A lot of the time, these armchair experts, their opinions are colored by personal circumstances, political views, or something else. But we've all seen the armchair expert. Next, the accidental idiot. Well, you've got someone who's in an environment where they should know what's going on. They post something out that isn't completely researched properly, or they haven't checked the efficacy of the information that's there, but they've got a degree of, by the very nature of where they are, something that should be a degree of authenticity, and they just put it out. They're not trying to do anything deliberate, but they're putting stuff. Or they take something that shouldn't be released and they release it out into social media, and it causes a degree of storm. And often these things shouldn't be released because they're not put into context, they're not balanced, and they haven't been approved, but we've seen it. The other thing, and this is the slightly more worrying one, is we've got the credible idiot with the agenda. The learned professor gives the science behind why we should have increased lockdown, or why the vaccine works, or why something else. But another learned professor sitting somewhere else decides that he wants to question the science and create doubt in the community that's out there, possibly because that scientist's agenda is that they were working on another vaccine, they got a different set of science, and they were snubbed at some stage, or often there's a political agenda, or their agenda has been bought and purchased. So we have to be careful for the credible idiot with an agenda that's out there, and question everything. This is one of the biggest worrying things when people are looking at social media for the sources of their information, sources of their news. If you look at what you can do on Twitter and Facebook and everything else, you get your feeds of information on Twitter. The arguments are coming in, you don't like the argument, you block or mute someone. And if you keep doing that over a period of time, you're only going to start to get feeds from people who are supporting your views, who are giving information in the way that you find acceptable, and it's reinforcing your thinking as to what's going on. Hey, everyone on my social media, I've got 10,000 followers. Those 10,000 followers are all saying the same thing that I'm saying, and therefore I must be right. Well, that's because you're 10,000 followers. You have blocked all of the followers who are disagreeing with you. So you're going to get that groupthink that comes through. And if you take that groupthink as public opinion, then your public opinion is skewed. It's self-misinforming groupthink. But can you be manipulated? Can someone actually look out and manipulate you? Well, this in itself is probably a completely separate presentation. So I'd urge all of you to go to greyhairmedia.com, just do a search on serotonin and look at how your serotonin can be hacked. There's two interesting studies within that blog that I wrote. One from Victor Danchu from the Bucharest University of Economic Studies with a paper talking about manipulative marketing, persuasion and manipulation of the consumer through advertising. Now, advertising is all about manipulating the way you think, making you feel good, making you want the product or the service that they're pushing out there. And how often do you buy something because you see it on an advert and it makes you feel good and the advertising gets right? There's a huge industry around this. That huge industry wouldn't exist if it didn't work. Combine that with what Dr. Michael Kosinski was talking about when he gained his PhD from Cambridge University and looking at big data. And we get into what was historically a claim around Cambridge Analytica and the use of big data, and that big data then to target messaging in a way that caused people's thinking to change. Now, a lot of people out there will say, it'll never change the way I think. Nobody can influence me in that way. Please just read the blog. I think you should be scared. If you're not scared, reread the blog, because you should be scared. You can manipulate the way people think by the way you carry out messaging, and the way you carry out influence operations. And that is what the Chinese specialize at, the Russians specialize at, the Iranians specialize at, and our governments get accused of doing it all of the time whenever we hear the cry fake news. Now, one of the areas that carries out these influence operations are what we hear of as called as troll farms. And certain governments around the world and certain institutions around the world have set up computers and hundreds, if not thousands, of fake accounts, pushing out fake information as much as they possibly can. A lot of that fake information is targeted to people that they believe will receive the messaging that's coming in. That targeting is done through big data analysis of people's wider social media profiles. Go back and read the blog on hacking your serotonin. A lot of the troll farms, though, can then be identified by national security apparatus, and they can be taken down. However, where you're getting a grey area is with a lot of the press. Now, there are press codes of conduct out there that turn around and talk about integrity, objectivity, professionalism, fairness, diligence, and most of the major press outlets will always make sure that there is truth behind their stories by making sure that they're using multiple sources to get the information from. One has to hope that those multiple sources aren't all from the self-groupthink social media perspective, and the main outlets don't do that. However, if we look at the different press that's out there, the press codes of conduct turn around and say, if you're putting an opinion rather than fact, you're supposed to say that clearly so that people can't be confused. Now, we see our newspapers, some of them are left-leaning, some of them are right-leaning, very few are down the center. But how many of them where the correspondent who's writing it says, in my opinion? They don't. They draw threads together and put out something that is their opinion because it's an assessment, but they put it out in a way that it comes across as being fact. All of that is potentially part of manipulation. And I think, and this is my personal opinion, that a lot of our press outlets are running very close to the edge, if not having fallen off the edge of the cliff of the press code of conduct, in making sure that there's true impartiality. A couple of the papers around the world that seem completely impartial to me, having read them, the Straits Times in Singapore, it just reports facts. Gulf News in the Middle East, again, it just seems to report facts. There's very little opinion in any of the articles whatsoever. It's just, this happened, and that's it. We don't see that as much in our national press in the UK, and certainly not in the United States. And that ties in with my bit in press impartiality. We've seen the criticism of Fox News and support for President Trump, no matter what it was that it was coming out with. But we have to look at our own newspapers and the potential for them to influence. And these headlines influence, the correspondence influence, they are all influencers and can cause an effect that will change the way people are thinking and will change people's activities. And we have to be very careful about that. And there's a huge responsibility in our mainstream press to make sure that we get that right. Ask yourself, are we getting it right? Now, I mentioned a lot of the sites with the troll farms and everything else. So surely if we can prove that there's disinformation coming out from somewhere deliberately, then that can be taken down, and it's a cybersecurity issue. We just get the authorities to delete the website and deal with it. Well, that's really difficult in a country where free speech is part of what we have fought for over so many years. And rather than it being a cybersecurity issue, I'd turn around and I'll put this out to industry and say, who in your organization is responsible for making sure the information and messaging that you're receiving, that's about your company and that's going out from your company, is what you want? Is it your comms team? Is that appropriate? Is it your cybersecurity team, is that appropriate? Or should it be somebody else? I haven't got the answer to that at the moment. We can talk about that at some stage later, but you need to ask that question. So there's so much more to this. It's a huge, huge area. I just wanted to introduce it. I can go through an awful lot more detail for anyone that needs it. My contact details are there. Please feel free to get in touch, but it's been a real pleasure talking to you today.